President Barack Obama Biography Summary. Part 6. Taking heat and taking the lead. With the temporary resolution of the budget battle, public attention shifted to the troubled rollout of Obamacare in early October 2013, and to the initially miserable performance of healthcare.gov, the website that acted as a marketplace for insurance plans and the place for those in 36 states to apply for health coverage. Republicans lambasted the website, which was often slow and erratic or simply inoperable. Far fewer users were able to access the site and apply for insurance than had been hoped, prompting the administration to order a tech surge in late October. Progress in overcoming the glitches was slow, but as healthcare.gov single quotes as performance improved, Obama went on the offensive, encouraging Americans to sign up for coverage at the beginning of April 2014. After the end of the first open enrollment period, he announced that 7.1 million Americans had signed up for private insurance plans through the marketplace. Meeting the administration's target, the debate over repealing this law is over. The Affordable Care Act is here to stay, Obama declared. Yet criticism of Obamacare and calls for its removal remained a rallying cry for Republicans as they prepared for the 2014 midterm congressional election. Events in the Middle East continued to make that region an important focus of Obama's foreign policy in 2014. However, the president's attention dramatically shifted early in the year to a developing crisis in Ukraine after widespread protests led to the impeachment and then the end of the presidency of Viktor Yanukovych, who called his dismissal a coup d'etat. Elements within the predominantly ethnically Russian Autonomous Republic of Crimea, supported by Russian troops, engineered Crimea's self-declared separation from Ukraine and annexation by Russia, confirmed by the Russian parliament in March. Obama joined a host of Western leaders in condemning Russia's aggressive actions and sought to isolate it by suspending it from the Group of Eight and imposing sanctions on a number of individual Russian leaders. Moreover, in a show of support for Ukraine, Obama met with its newly elected president, Petro Poroshenko, in early June. At the end of May, 5 Taliban leaders who'd been prisoners at the Guantanamo Bay detention camp were exchanged by the Obama administration for Bo Bergdahl, a U.S. Army sergeant who had been a captive of the Taliban in Afghanistan since 2009. The exchange was initially hailed as a victory for the administration, but it quickly became controversial. Some Republicans argued that the administration had given up too much for Bergdahl, and politicians from both sides of the aisle criticized the president for failing to consult Congress prior to the exchange. Law required the administration to give Congress notice 30 days before releasing Guantanamo Bay detainees. The White House cited evidence of Bergdahl's failing health and other factors that necessitated urgent action. The matter became further clouded by the ambiguous circumstances of Bergdahl's capture, including allegations that he had attempted to desert. Meanwhile, in early summer 2014, nearly 3 years after the removal of the final U.S. troops from Iraq, Obama found himself forced to again respond to events there when the controversial U.S.-supported regime of Prime Minister Nur al-Maliki was threatened by the takeover of several cities, including the country's second largest, Mosul, by a rapidly spreading Sunni insurgency spearheaded by the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant ISIL. also known as the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, ISIS, and as the Islamic State, a group that emerged in April 2013. Some critics sought to blame Obama for this new instability in Iraq, accusing him of having removed U.S. troops too soon. The president remained reluctant to put boots on the ground, even as he dispatched some 300 U.S. Special Operations troops in mid-June to train, advise, and support Iraqi security forces, and he called on the Iraqi government to resolve the situation. Malik's State of Law coalition had won the largest number of seats in parliamentary elections in April 2014, paving the way for Malik to claim a third term as prime minister. But in response to pressure from former supporters both inside and outside Iraq, he stepped aside in favor of a less divisive figure from the State of Law coalition, Haider al-Abadi, who was nominated to form a new cabinet in early August. On August 8, the United States began to launch airstrikes against ISIL in Iraq to prevent it from advancing farther into Kurdish territory. In September, Obama responded even more aggressively to ISIL's advances in both Iraq and Syria, as well as to a growing sense of the terrorist threat posed by ISIL elsewhere brought home to Americans, through videos released by ISIL depicting the beheadings of two U.S. journalists held hostage by the group in a televised address on September 10th. Obama announced that he had initiated a significant escalation of the campaign against ISIL, including the authorization of airstrikes inside Syria for the first time, and an increase of those in Iraq. Although he continued to pledge that he would not return U.S. combat troops to the region, Obama asked Congress to approve some $500 million for the training and arming of moderate Syrians in the following weeks. As U.S.-led attacks increased, Obama championed an effort to grow the coalition of countries that had committed to confronting ISIL. By the end of September, some 20 countries were contributing air support or military equipment to the coalition effort, including France, Britain, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, Qatar, and Bahrain. Dozens of other countries provided humanitarian aid. An effort to expand that coalition and to define the necessity of combating ISIL's network of death was central to Obama's speech to the United Nations General Assembly on September 24th. Also in that address, he echoed his September 10th speech in denouncing Russia's actions in Ukraine, and he called on the world to come together to respond to global warming and to help contain the outbreak of the Ebola virus in Africa. A number of political observers praised the president for putting the United States at the forefront of these efforts, after having been, in their eyes, recently indecisive in his foreign policy. Executive action and the 2014 midterm election. On the domestic front, Obama continued to use the power of executive action to address issues that remained bogged down in Congress. In February 2014, Obama, unable to persuade Congress to raise the federal minimum wage, signed an executive order raising the hourly minimum wage of federal contract workers to $10.10. In June, he took on climate change, directing the Environmental Protection Agency to instate new rules calling for power plants to significantly reduce their carbon emissions by 2030. Speaker of the House Boehner responded to Obama's use of executive action by accusing the president of having repeatedly run an end-around on the American people and their elected legislators. and by threatening to bring a lawsuit against him for misusing his executive powers, so sue me, a combative Obama said in early July. His remark aimed at House Republicans as long as they're doing nothing. He continued, "I'm not going to apologize for trying to do something." Immigration reform, an issue that Obama had attempted to address in June 2012 with executive action. The Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals policy, often called DACAR, that deferred for 2 years deportations of immigrants who had come to the United States illegally as children, was back in the spotlight in 2014 as a crisis rose along the country's border with Mexico. From October 2013 to mid-June 2014, some 50,000 unaccompanied children from Central America were apprehended attempting to enter the U.S. illegally. In July, the administration sought $3.7 billion from Congress to confront the crisis. In early August 2014, Obama carefully sought not to take sides when the fatal shooting of Michael Brown, an unarmed African-American teenager, by a white police officer, resulted in days of civil unrest and protests fueled by tensions between the predominantly black population of Ferguson, Missouri, a St. Louis suburb, and its predominantly white government and police department. The president did, however, cite the incident in his September speech to the UN as an example of our own racial and ethnic tensions, while pointing to the failure of Americans at times to live up to our ideals. On September 19th, there was a scare at the White House when, only minutes after the first family had left the residence, a man leapt the surrounding fence and made his way into the White House. The security breach spurred a congressional hearing that addressed other recent lapses by the Secret Service, and soon afterward its director, Julia Pearson, resigned. With Obama's approval rating bobbing at about 40%, Republicans framed the midterm congressional elections in November 2014 as a referendum on his presidency. The electorate seemingly unhappy with the president's response to the Ebola crisis, the advances of ISIL in Iraq and Syria, congressional gridlock, and a range of other issues, as well as being disappointed with the pace and nature of the economic recovery, handed the Democrats a crushing defeat. In gaining 12 seats, Republicans were in a position to match the largest majority that they had enjoyed in the House since 1947, and, moreover, they retook control of the Senate, gaining 9 seats to reach a total of 54. After the results were in for the December runoff election in Louisiana, a Republican victory. On November 20th, Obama once again employed an executive order in an attempt to overcome legislative gridlock when he announced reform of U.S. immigration policy that would grant work permits and temporary legal status to more than 4 million illegal immigrants. The action would delay deportation and allow parents of children who were legal residents or U.S. citizens to apply for 3-year work permits, provided that they had been in the country for 5 years or more. The order also removed the age limitation from the president's 2012 executive order regarding immigrants who had been brought to the United States as children, and changed the year by which they were required to have immigrated from 2007 to 2010. Vowing to counteract the order, Republicans accused Obama of skirting Congress and engaging in an imperial presidency. In December 2013, at a memorial for South African leader Nelson Mandela, Obama and Cuban leader Raul Castro had shared a handshake that seemed to offer symbolic new hope for improved Cuban-U.S. relations. On December 17, 2014, after some 18 months of secret negotiations fostered by Canada and the Vatican, that handshake bore fruit as Obama and Castro simultaneously addressed national television audiences to announce the normalization of relations between the United States and Cuba that had been suspended in January 1961. We will end an outdated approach that for decades has failed to advance our interests, Obama said. At the beginning of his administration, he had hoped to restart relations, but that initiative had been undermined by the incarceration of Alan Gross, a subcontractor for the U.S. Agency for International Development (USAID), who had been held in Cuba since 2009 after being convicted of importing illegal technology and attempting to establish secret internet service for Cuban Jews. The announcement of renewed diplomatic relations was accompanied by the release of Gross and a prisoner exchange of 3 Cuban intelligence agents who had been captive in Cuba for nearly 20 years. Because the more than 5-decade embargo on trade with Cuba was codified in U.S. law, rescinding it was beyond the scope of Obama's executive authority and would require congressional action, which was anything but assured given the widespread opposition among Republicans to normalizing relations. Nevertheless, Obama was able to mandate the establishment of an embassy in Havana, a review of Cuba's status as a state sponsor of terrorism, and the easing of some travel and financial restrictions, including an increase in the amount of money expatriates were allowed to remit to Cuba. In December, Obama's response to police violence was again questioned after a grand jury failed to indict a New York City policeman for his responsibility in the death of Eric Garner, an unarmed African-American man who died after having a chokehold applied to him during his arrest on Staten Island in July. The president and New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio established a task force charged with improving relations between minority communities and police. But many of those around the country who had taken to the streets to proclaim that Black Lives Matter felt that Obama was not doing enough. Baltimore riot, Charleston shooting, Supreme Court approval of same-sex marriage, and agreement with Iran. The first half of 2015 was a roller coaster ride of low and high points for the president. On one hand, the country continued to experience a rash of deeply troubling incidents of race-related violence, while on the other hand, the Supreme Court ruled as the administration had hoped it would in a pair of landmark cases. In an episode reminiscent of the events in Ferguson and Staten Island, on April 19th, a young African-American man in Baltimore died a week after incurring a severe spinal cord injury. While in police custody, rioting erupted in Baltimore on the day of his funeral, April 27th, as troubling as the incidents of police violence and the issues of police accountability were. The country was even more stunned and saddened when, on June 17th, 9 African Americans were shot and killed, allegedly by a young white man, in a hate crime in a historic black church in Charleston, South Carolina. In his eulogy for one of the shooting's victims, the Rev. Clementa Pinckney, a South Carolina state senator, Obama addressed gun control, race relations, and the symbolic impact of the Confederate flag, which he said represented more than just ancestral pride because for many it was a reminder of systemic oppression and racial subjugation. In the wake of the shooting, The flying of the Confederate flag at the state capitol in South Carolina was the object of renewed criticism. And on July 10th, in response to legislative action by South Carolina lawmakers, the flag was removed permanently from the Capitol grounds. Obama's hopes for the removal of discrimination received a huge boost on June 26 when the Supreme Court ruled in Biography v. Hodges that state bans on same-sex marriage and on recognizing same-sex marriages performed in other jurisdictions are unconstitutional under the Due Process and Equal Protection Clauses of the 14th Amendment. The ruling thereby legalized the practice of same-sex marriage throughout the country. One day earlier in King v. Burwell, the Supreme Court further solidified the legality of Obamacare by upholding that part of the legislation that allowed the government to provide subsidies to poor and middle-class citizens in order to help them purchase health care, lifted by those successes. Obama's approval rating climbed over 50% for the first time in more than 2 years. July brought yet another policy success for the president, when a final agreement was reached between Iran and the P5+1, the United States, and the other permanent members of the UN Security Council. China, France, Russia, and the United Kingdom, along with Germany, that placed limits on Iran's nuclear program in exchange for the reduction of sanctions against the country. The agreement came after more than a decade of negotiations over Iran's nuclear research program, which many observers suspected was aimed at developing nuclear weapons, though Iran maintained that it was intended for peaceful purposes. An interim agreement had been reached in November 2013, and the final agreement largely followed the terms of the framework document that was accepted by all parties in April 2015. Under the terms of the agreement, Iran would greatly reduce its nuclear stockpile over a 10-year period and give inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency access to its nuclear facilities, in exchange for the gradual removal of sanctions and praising the agreement. Obama said that every pathway to a nuclear weapon for Iran had been cut off, but many Republicans were quick to denounce the accord, which Congress had 60 days to consider with the options of accepting, rejecting, or taking no action on it. On September 10th, the Republican-led effort to reject the treaty was stalled in its tracks, when opponents of the agreement in the Senate were unable to secure enough votes to overcome a Democratic filibuster that had blocked the passage of a measure aimed at repealing the treaty. Yet another major policy goal had been achieved by Obama, without the aid of a single Republican vote. In that vein, on August 3, 2015, the president announced new climate regulations requiring U.S. power plants to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 32% below 2005 levels by the year 2030. The new rules also required that 28% of electrical generation be fueled by renewable energy by the same deadline. In February 2016, however, a lawsuit brought against the action was granted a stay request by the Supreme Court, even before the regulation had been reviewed by a federal appeals court, an unprecedented step that critics described as judicial activism. The stay was to remain in place as the lawsuit made its way through the courts, with a final decision possibly not coming until 2017. Environmentalists were able to claim a victory in November 2015, when Obama, having completed a 7-year review, announced that he had rejected the proposal to build the Keystone 40 oil pipeline from Canada to the U.S. Gulf Coast, supporters of the pipeline had argued that construction of the pipeline would create jobs and promote economic growth, while opponents countered that extracting the petroleum from tar sands in Alberta would contribute significantly to global warming. The August 14 flag raising presided over by Secretary Kerry at the reopened U.S. Embassy in Havana provided a foreign policy milestone for the Obama administration after the U.S. and Cuba had officially opened their embassies in each other's capital on July 20th. At the end of July, Obama had become the first sitting U.S. president to visit Ethiopia, as well as the first U.S. chief executive to address the African Union at its headquarters in Addis Ababa in early October. After some 8 years of negotiations, another of the president's principal foreign policy objectives appeared within reach with the signing in Atlanta of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, a regional trade deal between 12 Pacific Rim countries: the U.S., Japan, Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, and Vietnam. Congressional ratification of the treaty, however, was far from a certainty. In the last half of the year, Obama again focused on the gun violence that continued to occur throughout the country, following the mass shooting at a community college in Roseburg, Oregon. On October 1, 2015, the president renewed his calls for action. At the end of November, there was an uproar in Chicago following the court-ordered release of a video showing a policeman shooting and killing an African-American teenager in October 2014. Days later, a gunman attacked a Planned Parenthood clinic in Colorado Springs, Colorado, killing 3 and wounding 9. On December 2nd, the country was further shocked when a husband and wife attacked a holiday party at a social services center in San Bernardino, California, killing 14 people and injuring another 22. Initially, Obama reacted to that incident as another example of the mass violence that can result from what he saw as too lenient gun laws. However, after it became clear that the assailants had militant Islamist sympathies, the president made a rare national television address on December 6th, in which he characterized the San Bernardino shootings as a terrorist attack and attempted to calm the fears of jittery Americans and reassure doubters that his administration took the threat of Islamist terrorism seriously and that it would be overcome. Republicans and some members of his own party continued to criticize Obama's response to ISIL as insufficient and flawed, having admitted in June 2015 that the administration still did not have a complete strategy to confront ISIL and still suffering for his 2014 characterization of ISIL as the junior varsity in comparison with Al-Qaeda. Obama, at the end of October 2015, authorized the deployment of several dozen special operations troops in Syria to help coordinate local ground forces in the north of the country and undertake other open-ended missions there in action that seemed to violate his long-standing promise to not put boots on the ground in Syria. The measure came at a time when Russia had become directly involved in the Syrian civil war, and the deployment was framed as part of an evolving policy that included a significant diplomatic effort to begin talks aimed at effecting a political transition in Syria. At the beginning of the new year, Obama returned again to the matter of gun violence, long frustrated by congressional gridlock that prevented the passage of gun-related legislation. On January 5, 2016, he announced executive actions aimed at expanding background checks for gun purchasers and recodifying the definition of a regulated gun dealer. Mindful of the kind of Republican accusations of presidential overreach that had landed earlier executive actions in the courts, Obama was careful to undertake action that he described as well within his legal authority. The redefinition of regulated gun dealing targeted online sales of guns and sales of weapons at gun shows that had not been subject to background checks. In his announcement of the executive action, Obama, reflecting on the tragedy of the 2012 Newtown shootings that had deeply affected him, wiped tears from his cheeks as he said, "Every time I think about those kids, it gets me mad, and by the way, gun violence happens on the streets of Chicago every day." Several days later, at a special televised town meeting at George Mason University, Obama discussed his executive action with both supporters and opponents of gun control reform. When Obama came before a joint session of Congress on January 12th to deliver his final State of the Union message, there was an empty seat in the gallery next to Michelle Obama. To symbolize the loss of life brought about by gun violence, the president struck a positive tone in his address, countering fears of Islamist terrorism by calling the United States the most powerful nation on earth and characterizing gloomy Republican assessments of the country's economic decline as fiction, while saying that the U.S. has the strongest, most durable economy in the world. Rather than recite a litany of policy initiatives, Obama, echoing former President Franklin D. Roosevelt's famous For Freedom's address, focused on four pivotal questions that were summarized on the White House's website. Number 1, how do we give everyone a fair shot at opportunity and security in the new economy? Number 2, how do we make technology work for us and not against us as we solve our biggest challenges? Number 3, how do we keep America safe and lead the world without becoming its policeman? Number 4, how can we make our politics reflect the best in us and not the worst? Having come into office determined to end partisan gridlock, Obama lamented his failure to do so. "It's one of the few regrets of my presidency that the rancor and suspicion between the parties has gotten worse instead of better.